Welcome to the Social Impact Level Up podcast. This is where we blur the lines between business, nonprofit, and impact. I'm your host, Wendy V, and in season 3, we're redefining success for social entrepreneurs looking to grow their revenue. If you have reality-changing ideas, this is the place for you. Let's jump right into today's episode. Where do you go when you want to learn how to become a good social entrepreneur? This is a great question for today's episode, and we are going to decode this mystery of how you learn how to social entrepreneur today. And our guest is Jim Kucher. I'm Wendy Velos, and I want to turn it over to you and just check in with you, Jim. Who are you and how do you make an impact?
Who am I is one of the most interesting questions. I decided a few years ago that if I ever did write my memoir, the title would probably be something like Stumbling a Sacred Path. My career has wandered all over the place, from doing lighting and sound for rock bands to selling insurance door to door to building technology companies and healthcare startups. And right now I pay the bills as the Associate Professor of Social Innovation at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. But I also write and consult and speak and generally irritate people. So that's sort of who I am, I guess. And then sort of how do I sort of focus on this whole impact thing is really about an understanding that I came to about 18 years ago now, that capitalism isn't really as bad as some people think it is. It's just horribly misdirected. And that the people who originally thought about things like division of labor and sort of, efficiencies and those sorts of things, actually were trying to make life better for people. Small but interesting fact is that Henry Ford, when he invented the Model T, was not actually trying to build a global conglomerate. He was actually trying to come up with a way that his workers could have steady employment and make a living wage. Of course, it's turned into something else very different from now. And there's a long, we could talk for hours about how we got there. But, money's not necessarily bad. It's, in fact, quite useful. In fact, but the other thing I think is money doesn't really have a moral component. It's just a tool. And like any other tool, how we use it and what we use it for is what matters to me. So
I love that you went straight to my first question about this concept around capitalism, because that is one of the underpinnings of this whole podcast, is that we can do something different to bring our impact into the conversation, specifically, I guess, as expectations as consumers. But we also have the power to do this as entrepreneurs and people who are, doing the work as well. So I love that you're here. And as I alluded, you're a change agent who teaches other change agents. So I don't know if that makes you like a
sometimes successfully.
Yeah. Meta level change agent. I don't know how that works.
I don't know. Sometimes the teaching is successful, and other times the teaching just annoys people. So,
Yeah, and I'm sure you learn along the way. But one of the cool
far more. I learned far more. That's the great thing about teaching. The great thing about teaching is you learn so much more than any student ever will. It's fascinating work.
Yeah, and I was going to say, you probably have the ability to move things from one person to another even, or lessons learned across different people or different projects, because you're sort of at this other meta level.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about higher education as an industry is there are a lot of people who sort of look at it as something that, once you attain a certain status, you just kind of lather, rinse, repeat. And, I've never found that to be useful. And I've also never found it to be interesting. So, to your point, you have to be constantly adjusting. And the other thing you realize after a certain amount of time is that students are not tuition paying units. Students are humans, and the students have intellect and experience. I often say the first night of a class that I'm not necessarily the smartest person in the room. I probably know some things that some of the students don't know, but they probably know some things that I don't know. So I look at it very much as a sort of a mutual journey of exploration, which makes it a lot more fun, a lot more interesting. The other thing that's fascinating is I always tell students that unlike some people that do what I do for a living, I actually get tired listening to myself after a while. So I'd much rather hear them talk than stand up there and pontificate for half an hour, which is odd to say in a podcast, but there it is.
Because you're going to pontificate for a half hour here. So it's okay. We do whatever we feel like here. So the cool thing I think about that is that it gives people someone to aspire to to see further in the journey, right? And I love that about our guests, because I want a lot of people to be inspired by that there is someone who's gotten to this different level of being able to think on these very complex topics, to be disruptive even, or to continue to lead in the way that they want to lead, and then also have other people be on their own journey inspired by that, changing things and disrupting in their space too. So I think it's really cool, which is why I invited you to be here.
Well,
And
thank you. I do enjoy it.
and I was just curious, as people are, maybe now more so than before, able to formalize their education in social entrepreneurship. When I started out, this was not even like a college subject I
Oh
could look
God,
for as
no,
an elective.
no,
So can
no.
you kind of give us an idea of where we're at, or where we've come from, and how people might be able to at least take advantage of some of these resources that exist now?
Sure. Well, I mean, there are a lot of programs out there. You're absolutely right. When I first started in this space almost 20 years ago, there were very, very few academic programs. There are now a lot of master's programs. Interestingly enough, one of the things I find fascinating about the sort of the state of the industry, if you will, and sort of training social entrepreneurs, is that most of the folks doing the work come from either nonprofit or social work backgrounds. Most of the people writing the really interesting research sit in business schools, which is a really interesting disconnect in terms of their backgrounds and their perspectives and all that kind of stuff. But there's programs out there, there's master's programs out there, there's some schools that have as part of a bachelor's degree, again, primarily in business schools, which I also find fascinating. We just made a shift actually at University of Maryland, Baltimore, where I work. We had a master's program, and we found out that all the people that were interested in the training and learning how to sort of apply this social entrepreneurship mindset to their work already had a master's. Again, because they come out of a nonprofit background or a social work background. And they're like, I really don't need another master's. So we actually shifted gears, and we now run the program as a 12 credit graduate certificate. So you still need a bachelor's degree, but you come in and it's much more concentrated, much more focused. We're also looking at digital badging, and a lot of other things, because the market in higher ed is moving very, very quickly to very, very much point in time sort of experiences. Give me a very condensed thing that I can do in, a month or two or three and get a specific skill set, as opposed to, I'm going to go off for 4 years and sit in the woods and contemplate. It's a very different experience now than it was. And I think COVID had a lot to do with that too, quite frankly, because people are much more used to, online church and online everything, and, podcasts and TikToks and all that kind of stuff. So, it's an interesting shift, but we found that moving to this more accessible platform is getting a good response so far.
Have you been looking all over the internet for templates that actually apply to social impact organizations? Check out learngrowthrive.wendyvelos.com for resources, courses, templates, and more. This is your one-stop shop for DIYer social entrepreneurs growing work that matters. Again, that's learngrowthrive.wendyvelos.com, where you can find solutions made just for you. You never know. Next time it's just going to be a TikTok series, and we're going to get a certificate for watching it. You might be onto something.
I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised.
That's the next evolution. Our attention span has gotten yay big.
Yeah, really. I'm sorry. What was your name again?
I know. What podcast are we on? What's happening right now? So I think one of the things that you could really maybe enlighten for folks, again, going back to this concept around capitalism and why business is not inherently bad, but money is necessary. I mean, money is necessary on the impact side to do the work, obviously. But on the business side, to be a sustainable business, you need money, you need income, you need revenue. So if people are
Landlord
struggling,
wants to get paid, you know?
yeah, we got to get the podcast out. Like editor needs to get paid. So if that's the business's struggle, which is one I hear constantly with clients, the struggle is getting revenue. But as an impact-driven business, you're trying to also stick true to your purpose, your value, your mission, whatever, all those other things. What kind of advice would you give to an entrepreneur who's feeling stuck in that problem?
So this is where I really start to walk away from the mainstream in a rather direct and overt way. I am firmly convinced that the social benefit industry, which is the phrase I prefer, I don't like the word nonprofit because it describes something you don't do and it's just a tax status, not an operating model. So I use social benefit, social enterprise, somewhat interchangeably. But anyway, that space, people who are trying to actually improve a specific social condition in a specific neighborhood. I believe that that work actually creates more direct economic value, dollars and cents, not feel good, not oh gosh, yes, I'm such a wonderful human for helping another human. Actual money more so than any other sector of the economy. The problem is we don't train people in how to quantify it. And we also don't train those same people in how to make the case to be paid for it once they can produce the numbers. So one of the illustrations that I use to do this, and I'm actually working with a program right now as a coach to help them realize this, is workforce development. Right? There are hundreds of thousands of workforce development nonprofits in the US. I did a quick Google search one time just of names and found 11,000 organizations in the US that have the words workforce development in their name. Right? So, and the logic model, the path, the work that those folks do is fairly simple and fairly consistent. You take an individual who's coming out of challenged circumstances, typically either returning from incarceration or recovering from addiction. You teach them a trade. You teach them how to be an electrician, a chef, a carpenter. And at the end of that experience, you place them with an employer. And the traditional nonprofit mentality says, yay, Jim is now clean and sober. He's probably not going back to jail. We have a party. We put Jim's picture on the cover of our fundraising brochure. And if we really got a lot of chutzpah, we actually might go to the employer and say, hey, would you make a donation? And all of that completely ignores the fact that there's an $8 billion industry in staffing, that there are people running staffing agencies making very good money to place people. And furthermore, it completely ignores the fact that the individual that has come through the job training program, that has returned from incarceration or recovered from addiction, is actually statistically proven to be a more loyal, more dependable, more faithful employee than the one you get from Indeed. So I'm actually producing a superior product and giving it away.
And asking for nothing in return, basically.
Other than a donation.
Yeah.
I'm an idiot.
Yeah.
I'm an idiot. I mean, plain and simple, that's moronic.
And it's those kinds of things, that the efficiencies that I guess people wouldn't maybe think of without the outside perspective or some help. You mentioned coaching, but any kind of assistance in seeing, well, even though you're able to produce the product, this qualified candidate, year over year, you're still maybe not maximizing how that qualified candidate could feed back into the input of the organization.
Exactly. And then when you get into more complex social situations, those calculations get more interesting. That's what I gave is a very simple example, but it's also a very common example. You can get into other situations where it gets, more complicated to calculate, but it exists. And there's actually a market and an industry for this. And the US is horribly behind in it. If you look at what's happening in the UK, if you look at what's happening in Western Europe with social impact bonds, pay for success formulas, it's going gangbusters, and the investors are getting all their money back and tons of interest, and the needle on the social condition is dropping through the floor. It's amazing work, and we're sitting here in the US going, no, we must make money. It's very bizarre. But anyway, that's my soapbox. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
We've had a few guests from the UK who have social benefit corporation or CIC designations for their businesses. And it's fascinating to hear how they've been able to leverage them for different types of projects or work that they're doing. So I definitely would recommend people listen to Carrie Tottingham if you're interested in that topic. She gave us a boatload about her organization. So the other question I wanted to ask, so kind of pivoting to you, you mentioned this at the top of our interview that you've had an assorted journey to where you are today, but you continue to somehow show up. You didn't burn out along the way, which is great. So, or maybe you did, and that's what led to the next things. But could you tell us just a quick glimpse into some time in your journey when you had to redefine success for yourself or for the sector, and how that looked and what
Oh, good
happened?
Lord. Every second Tuesday.
Now I want
Yeah,
to know what meeting is on second Tuesdays.
yeah, well, it's interesting. I actually was just reading something. There's a Substack by a woman by the name of Jen Heights, who writes some interesting things, and she was writing something I was reading yesterday about the difference between progressing and expanding, right? And again, it's a U.S. concept, and if you've gathered by now that I'm a little down on the country I live in, you're perceiving me accurately. Um, but she talks about how we have this notion, particularly when we're young, of I'm going to progress, and I'm going to get this job, and it's going to get me a promotion to that job, and then I'm going to get this house, and then I'm going to buy that house, and I'm going to get this car, all this kind of stuff. Moving up the ladder, it's a very common American term, as opposed to expanding, where you become a better whole person, right? And I think that's probably the most recent shift for me. I mean, but you can all go all the way back to, well, I was 2 days away from being the sound man for a Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, which A dates the hell out of me, and B tells you that I've made some bad decisions in my life.
And C sounds amazing.
But the best way I could sum up your question, the best way I could answer your question, is something I discovered a few years back when I turned 50, which was a quote from an extremely surprising source, Muhammad Ali, who you would not think of as a deep philosopher, but actually was pretty hip in a lot of ways. And he said that if a person thinks the same at 50 as they did at 20, they've wasted 30 years. And I was like, dude. So
mic drop.
yeah. It's like, it just kind of goes. So it's a constant reinvention. It's just constant.
Yeah, that's so true, because if you are the same place, we talk a lot in this podcast about growth mindset. As things happen, as you go through the journey, you kind of have to grow if you encounter a challenge at some point. But sometimes, those lessons are kind of rough.
Yeah. On the other hand, I'm not a huge fan of Kelly Clarkson's "What doesn't kill you make you stronger." So I'd rather not have to bleed to learn those lessons. Although I have a couple times.
Yeah. But you're still intact, so we're good.
So far.
Yeah. So when you and I met, and people may not know this, but I can tell people how we met. We met through one of our previous podcast guests, Devin Thorpe, who had a crowdfunding event here in Maryland, and you were one of the speakers. And I quickly came up and said, "Oh, I like what you had to say. Could you join my podcast?" And, I'm curious where you think crowdfunding has its place in this impact landscape, kind of in reflection maybe of after taking away that event, but just in general of what you've been thinking about with crowdfunding.
Yeah, no, I think much like some of the other tools we mentioned a minute ago, the crowdfunding is grossly underutilized, and happily, there has been some legislative changes that have made it a little easier to do. But one of the things that I think is interesting, going back to my comment a few minutes ago about how social benefit organizations don't capture the value that they create, is the first thing you have to do is you have to quantify that value. And you can do it two ways. You can do it by analogy, which says other people are doing this work and they're having these results, and I'm going to do the same thing. Or you can do it by statistical demonstration of your own effort. The one that's going to get you invested is the latter, right? I mean, you're not going to get a big investor to come in and say, oh, that's great. You're going to do what Wendy does. Okay, great. Here's $1 million, right? They're going to want to see, okay, your program has been producing this result over time. So you're not going to get to that investing equation the day you open the doors of your social enterprise. It's just not going to happen. So you need other sources of capital to get you to that point where you can build that statistical database and make that case to get paid for the good work that you're doing. That's where other sources of income come in, whether it's charity, individual donors, or philanthropy, grants, or crowdfunding, right? And it's those small dollars that get you in the door. And that's the place where I think I almost look like crowdfunding as the investment version of a house-to-house donor campaign, right? And if you talk to anybody that's been in nonprofits, they understand, pass the hat and ask for a buck, right? But, pass the hat, ask for a buck, and, oh, by the way, you now own 1/100th of my company. But it's kind of the same conversation, because there's really not, at the crowdfunding level, there really isn't a lot of hard financial outcomes-based data to go on. It's really just, hey, Wendy's cool and I like her and I think she's going to do cool stuff. And, here's $1,000, right? So I think it's got a lot of potential in the social enterprise space. I think it's got frankly huge potential in the social enterprise space. And I say that whether you know Devin Thorpe or not.
Yeah, whether you know what we're talking about or not. And I the thing that I think is interesting, having been a funder giving away millions of dollars from the federal government perspective, the one thing we couldn't do is get to the grassroots level very nicely. And whether you went all the way to the city and said give out micro grants that are $1,000 or $5,000, there was always some sort of catch to it anyway. And I think that even with the reporting requirements and things that exist with crowdfunding, there's still a barrier for these micro projects, these seed projects, these little tiny startup or the church, like faith-based kind of projects. Those, I still see a gap. I don't see a great solution for, and I don't know if you have seen something that you like, but I think for that problem, I still haven't found anything that I see someone consistently doing.
I don't think charity is a bad answer at that stage, And it's interesting too, because one of the things that I see a lot is that folks who are aspiring to bring about social change reflexively think that the first thing they need to do is they need to file as a 501c3, which I say is a mistake for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is it's going to take you 18 months and $10,000. But it's a tax status, not an operating model. Figure out how you're going to get there and what you want to be first, and then decide how you're going to file your taxes. But that does not prevent you from getting charitable dollars, because there's a wonderful, also underutilized tool in this country called fiscal sponsorship, where you can effectively rent somebody else's nonprofit status for very few cents on the dollar in most cases. And every grant maker in the world, there's people, and when you talk to people about fiscal sponsorship, they go, oh yeah, but the grant makers, I'm like, the grant makers invented it. The grant makers are the ones that actually figured out how to do fiscal sponsorship. So no grant maker is going to bother with that. And individual donors don't care. So, any 501c3 can be a fiscal sponsor to any other organization. There are organizations that are set up intentionally to be fiscal sponsors. There is a national network of fiscal sponsors. I was on their board for a year and a half. So, it's just incredible. And people go, you can do that? I'm like, yeah, man, you can do it in a heartbeat. You don't have to deal with this stupid 501c3 filing until you know what's right for you. So, that's another underutilized tool. So I think that small donor base, when you're really in that head scratching, I got an idea, I don't know if it's going to work, kind of, what the entrepreneur educators call the ideation stage. When you're in that head scratching time, charity is a great answer. Individual donors. Hey man, give me $100. I want to go see if this works.
Yeah, but you don't yet have outcomes to go and ask for crowdfunding. And I think that's where sometimes people think crowdfunding comes in that early stage. But from what I can gather, it's really more about if it is, that's the popularity contest aspect of it. Because you just like Wendy, you think she's going to do cool stuff.
Well, but there's some of the crowdfunding equation, I think, also depends on how you present it to the investor, right? If your presentation to the investor is, oh, I can give you returns that are at market or better, then yeah, you damn well better have those statistical results. But if it's, look at angel investing in a biotech company, right? At that point in the conversation, I've got a petri dish in a lab with some things growing in it that may or may not do something. I have a student right now who is actually a medical doctor and a PhD and is working in my program to learn how to be a social entrepreneur. And he's got this amazing idea and he's got all this funding. And I said to him, I said, do you know this thing works yet? He goes, no. But he's got millions of dollars from federal funders to experiment, right? And angel investors are going, hi, can we come in now? Right? I mean, how much more of an indeterminate outcome is that than I want to help people learn how to be sous chefs so they can be employed and not go back to their old ways.
Yeah, it reminds me of a lot of social entrepreneurs, whether they like it or not, are creating evidence-based programs. And they maybe don't have the evidence base or the program yet.
But they've got the heart.
They have the idea for one. They have the outcome they want. Yeah. And it is something about the passion that I think fuels people to get through those challenges and figure out those early questions about structure and who and how and those kinds of things. But you're right, if there is a shortcut, then it is, always helpful for us to take those shortcuts. So definitely check out the program that you were mentioning, but also you have a book. I know that and so I wanted to ask you if you could maybe tell people what they could find in your book.
So the book came out of work that I did helping a university in Newfoundland, Canada, of all places, build an MBA in social entrepreneurship. I did a Fulbright up there a number of years ago, and I presented it at a conference. And I got this email from this woman who said, hi, I liked what you said in your presentation. Can I buy you a cup of coffee? And I said, sure, because I'm an entrepreneur by nature. Somebody wants to talk to you, you talk. And we sat down. We had a nice conversation. She was very kind about what I had to say. And she said, I'm an acquisitions editor for a publisher. I said, okay, I didn't know that was a thing, but apparently it's a thing. And she said, I think there's a book in this. And I said, well, then I do too. So it was an amazing experience. It's essentially things to think about when building a social enterprise and things to not think about. And one of the things to not think about is the one I've been banging my shoe on the table about a little bit in this conversation, which is deciding to become a 501c3 ahead of time is a dumb idea. Another one that I think is not a good idea necessarily is worrying about scale, right? Sometimes in social intervention, sometimes location really matters. I have a friend and colleague. You're based in this part of the woods. You may have heard of an organization called Vehicles for Change, run by a great guy by the name of Marty Schwartz. Marty's been in business now for 25 years. It's amazing. But his program works in cities that have lousy mass transit. So he's never going to be effective in New York. He's never going to be effective in DC. He's never going to be effective in Chicago. He's only going to be effective in cities that have lousy mass transit or really, really bad car problems. And even there, he tried to go out to LA. LA didn't work for a lot of reasons. But anyway, location matters in social enterprise in a way that it doesn't necessarily matter in commercial enterprise. So I think the notion of scale in social entrepreneurship is often misguided. I think that there is way too much social and not enough entrepreneur, but we've been talking about some things that how to change that in the last couple of months. We've been talking. I think you have to recognize that it's messy in a way that even commercial entrepreneurship isn't messy because you've got stakeholders and all these other people. I think you have to realize that marketing has multiple facets to it. You have to market to your constituents in a very different way that you market to your investors, which is a very different way you market to your customers. So there's about 10 or 12 things you should do and a half a dozen things you shouldn't do. And that makes 16 chapters. And there you go.
I love that because you just described the social business model that I use for this is the marketing, the impact, and the profit mission all coming together. And it is important to have that marketing piece fuel it. And then we could have a whole other conversation just about that. But we've taken up a lot of your time today. And I wanted to give people the opportunity to connect with you. Can you do one last plug for yourself and just tell people if they need to find you, where can they find your work or connect to you, or even the program that you mentioned?
So thanks again, Wendy. Yeah, so you can find me by email at jkucher, Kucher, at umaryland.edu. You can find me on LinkedIn. The program that I run at the University of Maryland, Baltimore is at graduate.umaryland.edu/social entrepreneurship. That's a mouthful. But if you just Google University of Maryland, Baltimore and social entrepreneurship, it'll come up that way. It's probably a lot easier than trying to remember that lengthy site. But yeah, LinkedIn is probably the quickest way, Kucher. But yeah, thanks. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, I love LinkedIn. It's a great way to stay connected. So,
and I found the barcode. I'm so excited.
Oh, the scan. Yeah.
The scan thing. I learned that at the conference where I met you. So I got two great things out of that day. One was meeting you and the other was learning how to do LinkedIn QR code.
I feel like most of the rooms I go into now, at least one person is excited about discovering that barcode in that room. It's kind of funny. I don't know what it is. Eventually, we're all going to know about it. Anyway, now the audience knows about it too. If you haven't figured it out, there's a way to use barcode to connect to people. All right, Jim, it's been wonderful to have you. And
my pleasure.
All the links will be in the show notes for the program that Jim mentioned. And if you can reach him on LinkedIn and get his book as well, that would be great to support his work. Thank you for being here and being part of the podcast, and listen to another episode. Stay tuned. Thanks for listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and we look forward to having you come back. If you're curious about what we shared, make sure you check down in the show notes below. And if you're ready to grow your revenue, I have a little gift for you. Download my Revenue for Impact guidebook at wendyvelos.com/guide. Until the next episode.